Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
Any act of cultivation knows that it is about nurture, it is about constant vigilance. Does it have enough water? Have I overwatered it? Is it time to feed the plant? Are there any pests around it? Is it growing well? And patience, because you can't expect a plant to flower within minutes of planting it, or you can't just put a seed in the ground and hope 6 months later you can come and reap the fruit. You have to be patient. And while you're patient, you're also hopeful. You're hopeful that it will flower. There are no guarantees, right? So you've got to wait and you've got to hope. I take these values of the practice of cultivation and apply them to democracy. And I think this is exactly what democracy needs. You can't, to go back to that distinction between democratic culture and democratic institutions, you can't just place democratic institutions and institutional framework and expect that society to become democratic.
Cultivating Democracy is a book that provides compelling ethnographic analysis of the relationship between formal political institutions and everyday citizenship in rural India. Dr. Mukulika Banerjee draws on deep engagement with the people and social life in two West Bengal villages between 1998 and 2013 to show how the micropolitics of their day-to-day life builds active engagement with the macropolitics of the state. Her sensitive analysis focuses on several events in the life of the villages. And shows how India's agrarian rural society helps create practices and conceptual space for citizens to be effective participants in India's great democratic exercises. Dr. Banerjee, social anthropologist, scholar, and author, engages in a conversation with scholar and economist Dr. Vijendra Rao on the various facets of a functioning democracy and lessons the urban setups can learn from rural governance. Over to Drs. Banerjee and Rao.
Hi, Mukulika. So nice to see you again, and it's a pleasure to have the chance to talk to you about your book, about democracy in general, about village life, village democracy. And I want to just get started by asking you to tell us about Cultivating Democracy and sort of give us a summary of what the book is. And I know it involves more than a decade of fieldwork. So tell us about that as well.
So Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India is the book that's just been published recently. And what I do here as an anthropologist is really push back against an institutional understanding of democracy only, which is a very partial way of thinking about democracy. When we say the word democracy, we immediately think elections, we think separation of powers, we think of free press, all the building blocks of what a democracy should have. And of course, it should have all of this. But there is also, of course, a cultural understanding of democracy. What is democratic culture? What is democracy in social life, as Ambedkar called it? How do people live with each other? What are the horizontal relationships between people that make up a democracy? So in the book, what I do is I put elections, and there were 9 elections during the 15 years that this book covers, because of course people are voting at 3 different tiers of democracy, alongside the inter-electoral times as well. What is happening in everyday life? What is happening in the village, and see what the relationship between the two are. So the first thing is that it's elections plus non-elections. Now, the second thing is we have to recognize that the institutional forms of democracy have a direct bearing on social life, but equally and less recognized is the fact that social life and its rituals have an impact on what kind of democracy we create. And to my mind, the point that I make in the book is that India being described as a democratic republic captures these 2 aspects very well. So democracy, the word democracy really stands for political democracy, for the institutional arrangements that you need to put in place in order to create a democracy. But the word republic really is about citizens. It is about what citizens are doing when they're not voting? What else is happening? And in a recent paper, I've called this an evidence of civic growth. Civic growth is a way to see the health of social democracy, in the way that we talk about economic growth to measure the magnitude of an economy. Civic growth, to my mind, seems to be a useful term to capture this. But rather than describe village life in its minutiae, which I think novelists from across India have done so ably, I pick 4 key events in a village life, right? In this, I am a classic anthropologist. I pick an event from each of the 4 key aspects of any social life in any community anywhere in the world, from religion, from the economy, from kinship, and from politics. And so through each of these 4 events, I show how these social dramas, as anthropologists of ritual would call them, these social dramas of these rituals, whether it is bringing in a harvest or whether it is marking and celebrating Eid through Qurbani, whether it is sorting out a naughty kinship affair that causes a scandal and a marriage, each of these events I show actually produce the values that are absolutely essential to creating good democracy. So they create values of, say, learning to cooperate with people you might not like. It may be learning the practices of deliberation, something that you've written so evocatively about, how to be vigilant about what others are doing and what you do in response to that, how to have some sort of commitment, say, to redistribution, which is, again, germane to democratic values, which is what I argue, for instance, Qurbani is about. It's not about consumption. It is actually about redistribution. And all of these events, therefore, are seen to produce values that strengthen democracy in the culture of the village. And in turn, elections, which is the 4th event from the politics aspect of village life, also produces its own values, not just in finding the next representative, elected representative, which is what elections are about, of course, but from the point of view of the citizen, it is also the only momentary glimpse that Indian citizens have of political equality, for instance. So that glimpse of what it is to be treated equally to all others is something that continues to inflect social life even long after the event has passed. And that's an argument about all these events. They are all fleeting, they last a few hours or a few days, but the effects of these quite profound transcendental values, which sound very highfalutin, are experienced momentarily, but it is there. It is there in people's consciousness until the next time the event occurs. So I call it politics and citizenship precisely because I want to get those 2 aspects of India as a democratic republic together.
I've read the book, as you know, I read it a year ago, and I loved it. It's one of the few books out there that's sort of an anthropology of democratic practice. They don't exist. We have a lot of books on village life, as you say. We have a lot of books on collective imaginaries and social imaginaries. We have a lot of books on festivals, going back to Victor Turner and so on. But to actually spend time watching how democracy works and then trying to distill from that, after having watched it for a very long time in a couple of villages, how democracy is cultivated is really what the book is about. So I want to go to that next. But I want you to tell us something about that metaphor of cultivation.
First, Biju, thank you very much. I'm delighted you like the book because your work has been absolutely inspirational in this field. And long before, I think, a lot of people were taking local government, panchayat, and what it does to democratic cultures and create practices of democracy and the value of being heard, of learning to speak. I mean, all of that has been absolutely central to the way one is thinking about democracy at this very local level. So it means a lot coming from you. Cultivation is key, and it works at 2 registers in the book. Right? So one is the literal practice of cultivation. It is an agrarian setting. 2 paddy crops and 1 wheat crop are cultivated or used to be cultivated when there was still water. And part of it is looking at a village in which the primary economic activity is cultivation. It is not the only economic activity. Very few places in India cultivate to the exclusion of other economic activities, but it is the primary. It creates the idiom of economic life in the village. So even if there were other businesses like brick kilns and so on, they are worked around the rhythms of cultivation. I learned a lot just hanging out with farmers in the fields. For instance, something that you would never think about unless you spend time with them is how wistful they were the years when everybody did not cultivate their plot of land. If everybody wasn't growing the second paddy crop, which was monsoon fed, they would say things, for instance, like, it's nice to do this with other people. It's nice when all of us are in the field doing our own thing and exchanging information. What it meant to be a farmer, to go out regardless of how you were feeling, what the weather was, you had to be there on the field to check in on the crop. That also creates certain, again, those inviolate ideas that I was talking about earlier, the imaginaries of inviolate commitment. What it is, unless you do it, you don't know. So there is the practice. And then, of course, because this is West Bengal we are talking about, and the communists were in power for 34 years, very early on, they introduced a land reform program, which was uneven, but in places where it did happen, like where I was doing fieldwork, it created radical change in terms of dignity. So economically, the jury is out, and there's a long discussion in the Harvest chapter on how one can assess what effect land reforms had on cultivation. But what is without doubt is that it created dignity for human labor by raising manual wages, but also through Operation Borga, where sharecroppers were given 50% of the entitlement to land. So this, there is no going back from. What it did in terms of self-belief and self-cultivation of people, of imagining themselves to be people who work the land and what that means. That was a very important part of the agrarian in this democracy. The second register at which the word cultivation works, of course, is what kind of values does it teach those of us who are not farmers? And can we think of practices of cultivation that each of us produce? And in the classroom, for instance, I ask my students if they have a potted plant on their windowsill. And any act of cultivation knows that it is about nurture. It is about constant vigilance. Does it have enough water? Have I overwatered it? Is it time to feed the plant? Are there any pests around it? Is it growing well? And patience, because you can't expect a plant to flower within minutes of planting it, or you can't just put a seed in the ground and hope 6 months later you can come and reap the fruit. You have to be patient. And while you're patient, you're also hopeful. You're hopeful that it will flower. There are no guarantees, right? So you've got to wait and you've got to hope. I take these values of the practice of cultivation and apply them to democracy. And I think this is exactly what democracy needs. You can't, to go back to that distinction between democratic culture and democratic institutions, you can't just place democratic institutions and institutional framework and expect that society to become democratic. It requires constant cultivation. You have to be vigilant, you have to nurture it, you have to practice it, you have to be hopeful, and you have to be patient. This is absolutely central to the business of building democracies. And if you don't do this, if you get complacent, I think the opposite of cultivation is complacency, that you just expect it to flower on its own. You could get the kind of backsliding that we have all worried about across the global context of democracy, where suddenly, lo and behold, people wake up and say, gosh, how did this happen? Why do we have suddenly a shutting down of the free press? Why do we have authoritarian tendencies rearing their heads? Why do we get majoritarianism? And we're seeing this in multiple national contexts across the world. And this comes out of complacency. So I want to attach the word cultivation to democracy as an essential part of it.
I like the metaphor. There's also an aspect of the metaphor, in addition to all the important things you said. There's sort of two very closely related words, rhythm and ritual. The idea that they have, every 5 years you have an election, there's a harvest season, there's a cultivation season, there's a irrigation season. That creates certain rituals around it. Scholars have famously described Indian elections as festivals, So that idea of democracy as a ritual, which, is so deeply ingrained within India now, in a very Indian way. It's not the same thing. Yeah, it's something in some ways far more personal, far more expressive. That one observes. I mean, I've been studying panchayats in South India, particularly for 25 years now. And so I was reading your book from that lens, from the South Indian lens. And there are things that are same and things that are different. One thing that is very different is, nowhere in your book do you talk about a water problem. Well, particularly Karnataka, many parts of South India, droughts are a frequent occurrence. So you're talking about the semi-arid parts of India. And so that the nature of cultivation changes, which affects the democratic rituals as well. Talking about this business of the spaces between elections, which is part of that ritual process. The 73rd Amendment not only has elections, it also has mandates, regular Gram Sabhas, regular village meetings where people come together to make deliberative decisions. There's both electoral democracy and deliberative democracy. That's sort of the magic of the theory of the 73rd Amendment, which sort of built on, as you may know, the 1983 Mandal Panchayat system in Karnataka. So Karnataka has a very, very long history of this, which is where we are right now, at least at this end. That sort of creates a separate kind of ritual. The way I think of Gram Sabhas is filling in the blanks between elections, So you go out and express your vote to sort of, say who you like and don't like, and that's a form of aggregating people's interests and preferences, as many people have written about. But then you come back to being an individual rather than part of a collective. You're not adding up things. Then you can say things, you can voice things in a collective space. In the presence of the Gram Panchayat council members, of the president, the vice president, and often pretty senior officials. Certainly the PDO in Karnataka is, the Panchayat Development Officer is an important official in the Panchayat, the senior bureaucrat of the Panchayat. But then you have nodal officers, even above that, attending these meetings, listening, reacting, learning. The book Paramita Sanyal and I did on oral democracy goes through these transcripts in some detail. So the question is really, to me, without that, I couldn't think of local democracy or village democracy, local village democracy in South India. I just couldn't think of it. Yeah, I've done some work in Bihar, and increasingly that's become true of Bihar as well. But there's a relative, it's not that you don't talk about it at all, there's a relative absence of it in your book. So I was kind of trying to understand why. Is it because when the Gram Sabhas were first mandated in many parts of South India 20 years ago because of the 73rd Amendment, they were often undermined, they were not held, or they were held in some pro forma way and some signatures taken, and they were, because it's not in the powerful people's interest to have them, Because one of the things they do, just as a festival does, just as your Qurbani thing does, you talk about distribution rather than consumption, it levels the playing field. Because in that space, because the local politician, the panchayat politician, can't afford to offend anybody, they allow a certain equality of voice, or equality of agency to happen within that space, right? So people express themselves freely, whoever they may be, different castes. I'll give a very nice example from our book that always resonates with me. It's a time of drought, and there's a Gram Sabha going on in a time of drought. And there are Dalit folks attending the meeting, there are upper caste folks attending the meeting. The Dalit folks live downhill, the upper caste folks live a little bit uphill. All these upper castes, they're not really upper caste, they're just non-Dalit people, complaining about the lack of water in their wells. And this is in Karnataka, in northern Karnataka. There's no water in our wells, there's no water in our wells, please do something, give us, trucks and send in water. The Dalit young man is in his early 30s, stands up and says, please come to our well, we have plenty of water. So, brilliant, right? And so that's the space that the Gram Sabha allows, right? So the question really is, tell us something about that, and why is there a relative lack of presence of that in your book?
This is West Bengal we are talking about. So I started the work very late 90s. I still go back every year, but the book ends in 2011. Right? So it's a 15-year period from 98 to 2013, when the panchayat elections are won by Trinamool. In those early days, you could not really, up until 2009, 2010, as late as that, really talk about politics in West Bengal. This is what the left front was about. Right? So, as we know, West Bengal was one of the first adopters of the 73rd Amendment. So the whole structure of local government and local democracy was put in place. But the party, the Communist Party of India, Marxist, also had a way of managing it in a way that they managed all elections, all elected representatives. So while, yes, there was a Pradhan, and as it happened, the Pradhan lived in our village, in one of the two villages, adjacent villages I lived in and studied. the mechanisms that you're describing and the conversations that you're describing and that open space of oral democracy was practically missing in large parts, and certainly in the parts that I was there. Instead, what you got was terror, and that's why I use the Bengali word shantrash. That is the way you describe the mood in rural Bengal at that time, where you literally didn't open your mouth to say anything. What it did to caste equations was interesting because of the land reform that I mentioned before. So there was an emboldened voice. People were given voice, given dignity, but within the parameters of a communist discourse determined by the left front. Women, therefore, were very often missing, for instance. So the women's wing of the CPM required women to behave and think and comport in very particular ways in order to be acceptable, including, their critique of Mukulika Banerjee, for instance, in those early days was precisely that she was not like them. And it was a very patriarchal notion of femininity. And everybody else, you could not complain or say things in an open sabha. You could not have this kind of oral democracy. There was silence. And part of the reason why I know so much about village life and almost everything other than politics was because that's all people would talk to me about, how you raise your children and how you cultivate paddy and how you weave mats, but they would not talk about politics. This was a level of violence and fear. And there was real violence and there was symbolic violence of all kinds. So as a scholar, it was actually a challenge to think, okay, what is democratic here then? Is this a sort of quasi-electoral democracy that we are talking about? Because it's it's going through the motions of winning one election after the other. And then you realize how people find spaces from non-political spaces to articulate opinion. And it was much harder to excavate that. But I knew it was there because if you look at the figures of those 34 years that the left front is winning elections, 40% vote share goes to the Congress before Trinamool is formed. They constantly the opposition gets 40% of the vote. So clearly there is an opinion there. And people use the secret ballot to express it, but they can't express it in any other way. That's why I described the hierarchy of local government and who so the Nathudom, who was the person I call Nathudom in the book, who's the Pradhan in the village, is very much a Pradhan and he has administrative power, but he's a rubber stamp for what the party decides and the comrade decides. Comrade and his networks decide. So local government doesn't work exactly in that way. But as you know, in a more recent paper, I've tried to show how, again, a sort of ostensibly non-political instrument like a self-help group becomes a space where women begin to articulate their critique of the comrade. And through that critique of the comrade, they are able to articulate their needs, their critiques of other things related to governance, and contributes to this idea of civic growth. So when the opportunity arrives of an opposition party gaining prominence, like Mamata's Trinamool does after the Singur Nandigram protests, there has been a cultivation of both deliberative practices in non-political spaces and a cultivation of oppositional politics outside the arenas of formal democracy, which then can be challenged into that kind of electoral contest.
It's interesting you say that because there's a paper in the EPW, I believe, by Bhattacharya and a co-author whose name I unfortunately forget, where they're looking at Gram Sabhas in West Bengal more recently than most of the time in your book, which showing them to be pretty active spaces. So clearly things are moving much more in the 73rd Amendment direction. I know West Bengal panchayats largely because of the work of Pranab Bardhan and Dilip Mukherjee. Both of them are, heroes of mine and mentors. And if there is one theme that runs through their entire body of work, which is all quantitative on West Bengal panchayats, it's the issue of clientelism and the issue of giving benefits with the view towards political gain. So that becomes a big challenge. What I'm trying to do is sort of move a bit into the local democracy space, because I think it's terribly important in addition to we've just had an election in Karnataka. It's been a big deal. Going from that big space to a more narrow space. Just to look at it from this point of view, from the southern point of view, one of the remarkable things you see going on in villages is the fact that village politicians are held much more accountable, even on a daily basis, than those in cities, and certainly those at a higher level. Because firstly, the proximity of the politician to the citizen, secondly, because of Gram Sabha, and thirdly, because of elections. I've just finished a paper that we'll be writing up soon, where this was done during the COVID era, in Karnataka. One of the fascinating things about COVID in Karnataka is rural Karnataka did a lot better than urban Karnataka. A lot better. Yeah. So one thing we've been trying to do is understand why. And I think the thing like COVID, local democracy matters less than local administrative capacity, and the Rural Development Department in Karnataka did a fantastic job with that. So that's one reason why. But they were working within panchayat systems. One of the things that happened was that elections were postponed. Panchayat elections were postponed in Karnataka during that period. 2020, they supposed to have elections, they were postponed. So the panchayats that had elections that were scheduled but were postponed were handed over to administrators. And these were relatively senior bureaucrats, but the PDO, the chap who actually does all the work, was the same. They remained in charge. What changed is who they were reporting to. Instead of reporting largely to the panchayat council, they were reporting to the top level bureaucrat. Now, as it happens, in 160 panchayats, elections were not postponed because they were not supposed to be held, because they were on a different election cycle. For whatever reason, from 20 years ago, they were on a different cycle. So elections were not postponed. In fact, the panchayat council is still in power. And as it happens, those what we call elected panchayats and what we're calling appointed panchayats were often in the same block. In Karnataka, we call them taluks, in the same taluk. So our econometric work compares into the same taluk the elected and the appointed, which gives us a marvelous opportunity to understand the added value of local democracy.
Right? Indeed. And your findings are?
The big finding, firstly, COVID, there's no difference. Yeah, so it's not really a COVID issue. But we did a survey of 100,000 people on the phone, asking them to list their top 3 preferences, of issues that, local issues that were in the village. And then we looked at millions of administrative records in the Panchayati Raj department of what items the panchayat had actually spent money on. And you can see the actual item, how much was spent, what was spent on what issue, and so on. The match between citizen preferences and what was actually done in the panchayat was much better in the democratic regime than in the appointed regime. Secondly, during COVID, as it happened all over the country, a lot of people ran back from urban areas to rural areas because they were coming home. And secondly, there was NREGA. They had a form of social support. So NREGA demand spikes hugely after the lockdown. However, in the democratic panchayats, it's 160 panchayats, there's a 15% better response of them getting jobs. You started describing your book, this whole business of being patient, of letting things grow and nurturing and so on. What is uniformly true in India is that high-level politicians and high-level bureaucrats, with very few and important exceptions, hate the panchayat system, dislike it. They want to centralize power. Because they go to a village and say, full of corruption, full of this. In fact, I'm working on a book on elections and corruption in panchayats, so I know that exists. There are huge problems. But the fact is, democracy results in better outcomes. That's what our paper is finding. So while it's noisy, it's messy, and you see the mess because it's so proximate and close, but so does every other citizen. As you must have found in your villages, it's not everybody there knows everything that's going on about everything. Yeah. Nothing is hidden. I mean, here, I don't know what's going on half the time. Most people don't, right? But there you know everything. And therefore, democracy is a much more personal interaction. And it's much more relevant to people's lives, I think, yeah? I guess where I'm going with that is to ask whether you see the same thing, whether there's any difference in how you see, whether it's a Karnataka effect that we're looking at, A, and B, and I think it's an important topic maybe for us to think about a bit, how much of this rural stuff can urban folks learn from? Because India is increasingly becoming urban, and we all know the 74th Amendment was, to put it kindly, ineffective. So should the 74th Amendment be amended again to be more like the 73rd? So these are two questions that always come up. So I thought I'd throw those questions at you.
What a brilliant paper, really, this one. I can't wait to read it because you had a control set up for you just by virtue of these different election cycles, right? So you could compare so clearly, starkly within the same space. So you can't really talk about variations. And that's so useful. And I think it also confirms work from other places in India where, say, for instance, I'm thinking of a recent paper by Adam Auerbach and Gabriel Crooks-Wisner, which explicitly compares rural politics in Rajasthan by Crooks-Wisner versus urban politics that Adam Auerbach reports. And I'm sure you know this work, where the thickness of the state, as they say in rural India, is much greater. And therefore, the reason why people know is not simply about scale, but the fact that there is a thick state people know who to approach. Sitting in Bangalore or Delhi, you don't know if you have potholes or rubbish collection exactly who is in charge of which. You don't know your local representatives. How many people know their local municipal commissioner or whatever? But in the village, they do. So I, could not agree with you more that even in a skewed system like West Bengal under the Left Front, where it is politicized in a very particular way by the Left Front, there is still, even people could see this relationship between actually petitioning their pradhan, but knowing that the decision was ultimately going to be made by the party, and how important, therefore, it was to stay on the right side of the comrade as much as of the pradhan, and how to play that game. But at least they knew and understood how government worked. And therefore, actually studying local government now with that political literacy that people have in a climate which is not dominated by a party state, as Bhattacharya calls it, would be really interesting. So actually the local government work in West Bengal now will be very fascinating to follow. And I intend to do this with some perspective, my next proposed research on taxation, because to my mind, taxation is vital to what you're describing. It's because you have expectations of the state ostensibly through some notion of the social contract, where if you're paying certain taxes to local government, then you would expect some things in return. But as we know, local governments in India, including in Karnataka, where it is so well advanced, has much less capacity to collect taxes than higher forms of government, and it's getting more and more centralized. The second thing I want to say is just quickly to endorse your, should the 74th Amendment become more like the 73rd? Absolutely. It links to a wider point about rural India, which you raised, which I like very much. And I completely have been, sort of say this quite forcefully in how I talk about the book, that we always expect rural India to be a receiver of ideas. And somehow the great intellectual breakthroughs happen in urban spaces amongst intelligentsia, and that we take this to the villages, this idea of the vanguard.
So, one big question that comes up with anybody who sort of works on village democracy is, how do we take the lessons of the 73rd Amendment to the 74th? The 74th Amendment, as we know, is rather tame. And what lessons can we learn about urban government from the rural experience? So it might be nice to sort of exchange notes on that, as it were. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think everything one knows from the work comparing rural and urban governments, like this paper by Auerbach and Crooks-Wiesner that I was referring to earlier, it's evident that because there is a thicker state in the rural, it also generates greater active citizenship, right? That people are engaged, they are curious, they are informed, they ask questions, they practice accountability, so they're asking for accountability from their elected representatives a lot more than people in urban environments where they don't even know who their elected representative. They don't vote that much in local elections. They don't know the names of their elected representatives and so on. So clearly the 73rd Amendment model being replicated in the urban is a very good idea. And I'm in agreement with you there. It also raises a much larger question about how we see rural India. And rural India, right from the very beginning of constitution making, and you have that very useful and wonderful paper on how old deliberative practices are in Indian traditions of different sorts, and how it feeds in through the colonial period, through Henry Main's work, into colonial governance, and then into Gandhi's thought of villages being self-governing institutions, which of course gets pushed to a side when the Indian Constitution is written. And there are reasons for that. And I discuss that in the book of, how you have Ambedkar and Nehru on one side, and you have Gandhi and Radha Kamal Mukherjee, and, a very interesting coalition of thinkers on the other side who think the rural should be given greater importance in being able to manage its own affairs. And that's something that the Constitution of India and independent democratic India hasn't done. But there is now enough body of work, with yours included, of course, to show that rural India is actually the originator of ideas. For instance, this idea of cultivation. You can really understand it when you look at people who are cultivators. And I don't think it is any coincidence that one of the most successful movements in India in the last 10 years was the farmers' protest. They won, which was significant because no other civil society movement has could say to have recorded a victory against the central government in the way that the farmers did. But to me, what is equally important is how long they had to sustain it with that intensity, of 12 whole months, a whole agricultural cycle by a bunch of farmers, who can't afford not to be there in the fields. This is not taking leave without pay. If you don't work, you don't get. And they managed it. And they created in their sites of protest a culture, a movement culture of a very particular texture, which I think we need to pay attention to, which I think, is an outcome of rural India. And finally, you mentioned Karnataka elections. After all, we are recording this the day after the results have been declared. And while there has been, as always, a fantastic body of work and research and surveys and comment in the last 24 hours on dissecting the results, as an anthropologist of rural India, I'm always interested in what the rural vote does. Right? There are two things. One is the fact that Karnataka has the oldest tradition of local democracy, which has cultivated active citizenship and civic growth in the way that we've been describing. It is not a coincidence that the turnouts are so much higher, that there is intelligent voting, that there is an ability to use the vote to express opinion. There is a maturity in the way that the voter behaves. We valorize the Indian voter. It has been a triumph of democracy. The Indian voter has spoken. Now, the Indian voter is not coming out of nowhere. The Indian voter is being shaped by both institutions and practices of the rural. And what better macro expression of this than what we saw in yesterday's results?
I will disagree with you on some of the empirics of that statement. I don't think it's got to do with the 1983 Mandal Commission thing or anything. I mean, Kerala has a far better panchayat system than Karnataka. Tamil Nadu is a very good panchayat system. Andhra Pradesh has a terrible one. Telangana is getting better. But let me come back to some of this idea about the rural to the urban and what we can learn from there. A long time ago, in 2000, I did a paper with Soumitra Jha and Raduban, with Michael Woolcock, that we called Governance in the Gullies. We spent several weeks in Delhi slums. And this was, before Adam and so on had sort of made this a important topic of study. So very little was known about how these slums work. And we found two things that I think are relevant. One is, and these were migrants from everywhere. They were migrants from Tamil Nadu, migrants from Karnataka. I speak 4 languages. I speak Hindi, English, Kannada, Tamil. I could use all 4 languages in those slums. It's amazing. Because there were people from everywhere. A lot of them saw their rural residences as sort of branch offices of their urban life. They would send money across. Remittances, of course, were common, but they would send their kids there to get educated. Some of the Tamilian parents. Our schools in the villages are much better. We don't want to raise them in this horrible atmosphere of the slums. You're going to send the kids there. Yeah. So there was the sense that one got, and I think that's become even stronger today, and Adam has written about that a little bit, of this distinction that we always have in our heads between rural and urban. It's no longer a distinction. There's constant interaction, constant ana-janaing, constant, and now with the industries moving to rural areas, they're becoming the hinterland of manufacture and so on. I mean, it's just going to be a seamless, not a seamless, it's going to be an integrated economy. So one of the things you saw in those Delhi slums, which completely blew my mind, of course, slums many of them were illegal slums. They had no form of formal governance, nothing. But they got together and ran their own panchayat elections for the slum, completely on their own. And the political parties were actively involved. There was no AAP in those days. It was Congress and, BJP and others were all involved in competing, campaigning, finding out, who's literally negotiating, clientelism, everything you saw in panchayat elections, you saw in the slum elections. And they were completely self-driven. There was no election commission, nothing. So they were bringing these lessons in because they found that was the practical way of organizing themselves and organizing their lives. And I think this is a common thing. Adam has written about it in many, many other cities. You see the same thing. Yeah. So the resistance, I think, to formalize this, I mean, this is really, again, all political parties should be in favor of this. There's nothing political about it. It's just a way of making governance more effective. But all political parties are opposed to reforming the 74th Amendment. And that's a good question is to ask why. The only answer I have, and I might be wrong, is that a lot of people have a lot to lose by making that happen. And it's not like people don't understand that it's a better form of government, but I think all political parties have a vested interest in keeping the system the way it is. There's no other explanation to me.
Can I just say two things in response to that? One is, I think, the new book that Adam has done with Tariq Tachel, Migrants and Machine Politics, which compares two urban settings in greater detail, may give us further clues into why there is so much more resistance. It's a book I've just begun to read. And the second thing, to just clarify, I think for listeners as well, is that when one talks about rural India and urban India, it is not to say that they're unconnected. It's not as if one is saying that they are separate places or there are some idea of village republics that we used to talk about in the 60s and 70s, but that, of course, they're connected, right? And COVID made this connection so visibly evident. And COVID also made evident how ruthless the urban and how uncaring the urban environment was, that it was better, even if you were going to die, it was better to die in a village than surrounded by some people you knew than to die like a dog, as one person said to a journalist in an urban setting. So they are connected. I think I mentioned taxation before, and there is part of the resistance, I think, to local government is also, it is, of course, it's a dilution of power. So the more you give to local government, the more you devolve power away from centralizing it in a fewer actors. You've got to disperse it more. But also it is to do with money, right? Who has control of the budgets? Who has the funds to deliver? And that has always been the conundrum. And that's why the resistance to central, I agree with you, but it is worth thinking even more carefully about, in different contexts, where this resistance is coming from.
I mean, and when the 70th Amendment was first proposed, and the Balwant Rai Mehta Commission long time ago, 60-something amendment at that time, but anyway, when it happened, I mean, no constitutional amendment can pass without a 2/3 majority in parliament, 2/3 majority of all the states and all that stuff, right? So, and there was a consensus across all political parties that this was a good thing to do. In some ways, it was a homage to Mahatma Gandhi, that all parties wanted to sign up for. How do we build that for the 74th is a question, and there's an organization in Bangalore that I've long been in communication with called Janagraha. That's run by Ramesh and Swati Ramanathan and others. That's been trying to do this kind of work in urban spaces, and always faced resistance. They still do a lot, but it's, they've not been able to make the amendment happen, as have others who have tried. But I think it's time for us to come together and make a stronger case for that, for deliberative spaces, ward sabhas, as we've called it here, for a more direct engagement between the municipal councillors and the citizens, for bureaucrats to have regular engagement with citizens in these spaces. You already have these residents' welfare associations. So there is in richer areas of resident welfare associations. In poorer areas, you already have these sort of informal forms of local government and democracy taking place anyway. So there is a lot of underlying interest in this in the citizenry. It's a matter of coalescing that into something more formal. Notion of cultivation, I'm coming back a full circle to where we started, can also be an urban metaphor. It's like urban gardens that are becoming fashionable, and people are, we all try to do that kind of thing. How do we make that happen? How do we make a groundswell of support for that? And it's not about left, right, or right, wrong, or anything of that sort. It is really at the end something that makes absolute sense to improve everything that we want this country to have. A better government, better economic growth, more equitable distribution, all of the things that we all like. It flummoxes me as to why people are not talking about this more.
I don't know. I mean, there is also a sort of underestimation of citizenship and understanding of citizenship and civicness in urban spaces. And I remember early work in Janagraha that I had briefly something to do with, when I think they were trying to build a citizenship index, trying to measure how people relate to other people, how citizens relate, what are those horizontal cross-cutting ties. And there are plenty of things that people get involved with that are community-based. So it's not as if you need to have some rural village community to have community life. There is community life in urban spaces. The one corrective and the one warning that I think we should heed also is how quickly our urban spaces in India have become socially distinct in terms of caste, in terms of religion. This danger we are seeing of ghettoization of communities, how the RWAs behaved during COVID, for instance, towards street vendors or towards domestic help, was a very good indication of that. But we see evidence of that. There are community activities, whether it is picking up trash or whatever. One thing that I do know from rural India and from the left front government, it has to be said, one of their important legacies was to show how far-reaching the consequences of small institutional interventions are. So, for instance, when they set up these self-help groups, they insisted it had to be a cross-caste group. And you wouldn't get the seed money unless you did. And that was all. That was the only condition imposed. But the character of the self-help group was radically different as a result. And it created real civic growth in a way that, banding together with your other caste members simply doesn't have the same quality.
West Bengal is clearly one place where it's happened, but every state in India has had similar movements with women's self-help groups. It's the other thing I've spent 10 years, 15 years working on. And the NRLM, the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, which started in 2011, had the same agenda and to make it national. So, you see self-help groups in every state now that, if anything, maybe sort of, they are cross-caste, but they're meant to be sort of more for poor families. So they tend to be focused more on lower caste groups, but they do work across religions. Yeah, and we have evidence of that in Bihar and other places, Tamil Nadu. So I think that, it's what the technical term in the policy circles in India is convergence, is to see the intersection between the women's self-help group movement and the panchayat movement. And so in rural areas, that's happening. In urban areas, again, you don't have the same effort being made to form self-help groups. Yeah, you have credit, you have more sort of standard microcredit type of stuff happening all over the place, which is different. In some ways, less social capital has been built, but the social capital that's enormous in other ways. Yeah. And one of the nice things about neighborhood meetings, about ward meetings, when they're not resident welfare association meetings, but just in a small area that's gated almost, is that you will force people with different points of view from different communities to get together and have a conversation. Yeah. And as Ashu Varshney showed us a long time ago, that does result in more communal harmony, right? So I just see absolutely no reason to be resistant to that, and I think it's clear, it's obviously clear to you as well, and I really hope that we all get together and sort of try to make that happen. In what way we can. It's been really lovely to have this conversation with you, Mukulika. I loved your book. I thought it's really makes a rather unique contribution, which is to provide an anthropological lens on the nature of democracy. There's not much work along those lines. What I hope it does is to generate a body of research that takes a more sort of rigorous qualitative look at the nature of government and the nature of democracy. There's been an enormous amount of quantitative work, much less qualitative. I would encourage my fellow economists to read the book, along with your people, the anthropologists as well.
Thank you, Biju. Thank you for such provocative questions, which kind of determines and sets the agenda for future research for myself and others. Thank you.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, please share it with family and friends. You can also leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible are Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studios. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcenter.org. Do follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to get regular updates on our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.